All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Galaxy Beacon. I'm Matt,
I am Carly.
And I'm Rob.
and today we're going to start the first of our series about galactic politics, and we're going to do this in chronological order, which means we are going to start with the Republic versus the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and we are going to kind of dig into what that whole disagreement was about, maybe some potential parallels to things that have happened in the real world to sort of explore, what happened, and talk about who had valid points and who maybe didn't have as many valid points as they wish they had. So that's what we're going to talk about. Carly, why don't you start? You like politics in Star Wars, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let's kind of start with a little bit of background here. A lot of people panned Phantom Menace in particular, but the entire prequel series for having too much politics in something that was originally like a fantasy story.
Yes, and I just completely disagree with that. I could not disagree more. I love politics in fantasy settings especially.
Right, gotcha. Because it lets you kind of explore.
It lets you explore real world ideas without getting bogged down by real world things, kind of. So you can actually talk about philosophy in a kind of free, open way. So I just find it very liberating to be able to look at politics and disputes within the Star Wars universe, because it's really interesting to look at all these ideas for an entire galaxy. Because here, I don't know, we're in America, so we can kind of only discuss politics as we understand it in this country, but on a Star Wars scale, this is for an entire galaxy, and they're all being ruled by one government, and just the idea of that is crazy, because it's not just a country. These are entire planets, in entire systems that are all being ruled by this one government.
And it's sort of one of those things that you see a lot in science fiction and fantasy, where it's on Earth. Earth is always the most complicated world in any given science fiction thing. Because, on Earth, we have multiple different countries that all have different leaders and stuff like that. And then in a lot of science fiction stuff, and obviously Earth is not in Star Wars, but in a lot of science fiction and fantasy stuff that has multiple planets or realms, they sort of treat each individual planet like it's just a country. We never see planets that... Yeah, we're kind of figuring out where this planet sits in the Galactic Republic, but also this planet themselves has a bunch of different countries that all have different leaders. The most we get of that is, terrorists with, the Death Watch and stuff like that, and all that's going on. Rob, before we get too deep into it, what's your broad strokes opinion on the way politics is handled in Star Wars? Are you into it?
Oh, I love it. Not so much, the galactic level I think is interesting. I do, especially the Empire, because it had so many levels, and you have hierarchies. Mostly the military hierarchy, but I guess when you're an empire, that's kind of your government.
Yeah.
But I do enjoy the individual planets, because you have, Tordaria has a monarchy. You've got places like Mandalore has its own separate political system that is just fascinating, and I'm hoping that once the series The Mandalore comes out, we'll have more of insight into how their system works. You have every planet has its own local government that it's just fascinating, and I think I love it that George Lucas, being a sociology major, knew from the beginning you have to have this depth, and politics is part of it. And he had no qualms when he got to episode 1, 2, and 3 of writing politics incessantly.
I think there's more politics in the original trilogy. There's more in there than I think people tend to remember. They do have lines about the Imperial Senate and how it's been recently or is about to be disbanded and stuff like that. So George Lucas was clearly planting those seeds from the beginning, because there is a lot of fantasy stuff that just sort of glosses over the political side of things, and that can make the universe feel less alive. But let's get into some specifics. So we decided we would look at each major conflict in the Star Wars saga and kind of go over both sides of the conflict in terms of politics. So we're going to start by looking at the Separatists versus the Republic. Carly, do you want to maybe give us a primer on why the Separatists left?
Well, there's no single reason why the Separatists left, but in a nutshell, the Republic they saw as ineffective. It wasn't representing especially Outer Rim territories as well as it was core worlds. So they just kind of wanted out. They didn't necessarily want a war, at least not the people who were actually followers, the people who were the Separatists. The leaders obviously were being influenced by outside parties and things like that. But the people who identified as Separatists didn't really want a war. They just wanted to be recognized as a separate government and outside of Republic rule.
Now, they were trying to form the Confederacy of Independent Systems, which would essentially have treated the planets almost like city-states.
Kind of, yeah. They would have been independent, able to make their own rules on, like, taxation of trade routes, for example, since that's one big hot-button issue.
Yeah.
Oh, thank the Nemoidians for that.
Yeah, and the Separatists, you know, it's interesting because they're a group that is kind of co-opted by Darth Sidious and Count Dooku from the get-go, and yet they do have these, you know, legitimate qualms with the governing republic, which at that time had allowed itself to be corrupt and kind of resting on its own laurels. And you see that a lot in Episode 1, where, you know, the queen of a sovereign planet is coming to you and saying, this is happening, and Chancellor Valorum is like, well, could you wait until we get a committee out there to make sure that you're, you know, telling the truth? And, you know, Palpatine looks at that and says, you know, this is why the Republic is in trouble, and, you know, calls for a vote of no confidence. And that was Palpatine just clearing the way for him to seize power, but was he wrong? Like, Chancellor Valorum being gone is probably beneficial to a degree. I mean, because he was clearly not the leadership that they needed.
No, he was very well known for being indecisive. Like, they talk about it in the propaganda book, about how just a simple piece of propaganda, like, for the, like, 1,000-year celebration of the Republic's peace, he had to redo it. He sent it back to the artist 250 times, just every time he was just nitpicking something, like, this isn't good enough. So this one piece of little propaganda that didn't necessarily need to be perfect, he kept finding reasons to keep going back to the drawing board.
Yeah, and that's kind of indicative of how
He just wouldn't make a solid decision on anything.
Yeah. Now, Rob, what is your... when you look at the Separatists, you know, what do you see? Do you see people with legitimate complaints, or do you see people who are just purely being misled?
Well, I think definitely in the Clone Wars series, you see that they had legitimate complaints. And
yeah,
they were just normal people. They really were banding together. I did have some problems. The people who worked closest to Sidious and Maul and Grievous were the heads of the unions and the other organizations. You had the Trade Federation, the Techno Union, the banking clans. Oh, there was another group. The Geonosians were their own thing, but were basically like major manufacturing.
Yeah, basically a lot of companies.
Yeah. But they weren't really companies. They were conglomerates. I find that interesting. So how was it really that the Separatists were being run by corporations in the background, which Palpatine was very easily able to take over because of their association with the Separatist Alliance. The banking clan, they were able to take over the banks and completeness. They were able, the Trade Federation, you never see anything more about them. They essentially were nullified. Techno Union, I'm guessing all their technology was given over to Tarkin and the Tarkin Initiative based on how much advanced technology he had at his disposal. It's just interesting. The really the only companies that were left unallowed to continue to work were the ones that stayed with the Republic, but they were still basically under imperial rule.
Sure. Yeah. The Empire just directly punished a bunch of groups that were pro-separatist. And that's kind of how they started, by fostering more loyalty for their own programs, by punishing people who were involved with the enemies of the Republic, essentially.
But taking over the banking clan was a masterful move. Just getting them to align with the Separatist and then just completely taking them over. Because these are guilds and things like that don't always go with what the corporations would do. So it's interesting that he went with that route of get those separated out and keep them in control of their planets and their areas. And then they become the other.
Yeah. From what I understand by looking at the whole issue, it was pretty easy to get most of these like corporate type clans and organizations on board with the separatist movement because of the way the Republic was handling trade routes and taxation and things. Because essentially what was happening was the Republic had been around for basically 1,000 years, and it consisted primarily of core planets. So things in like the inner rim and the mid rim that had been part of the Republic for a really long time. In the early days of the Republic might start getting deals, basically. So if you have an agreement between Naboo and Coruscant that you're going to get this plasma at this price, you essentially have that deal that's going to continue into the future. So when the Republic then decides they're going to have an intergalactic tax now on all plasma, since way like the hundreds of years ago that this agreement between Naboo and Coruscant happened, several new systems have come into play. So we have a ton of new planets, and now they're being taxed at this full price, but Naboo comes back to Coruscant and says this is against our agreement we had. And so the Republic ends up honoring these like little agreements between all its planets. So these wealthy, like, not really nations, but these wealthy
established
systems,
planets.
yeah, these wealthy established planets are getting benefits just by by being in the Republic for so long. They have like grandfathered in plans that allow them to reap benefits and get wealthier and wealthier, whereas like outer rim planets are feeling the full brunt of these taxations. So they're having to pay a lot more taxes to get basic goods that wealthier planets aren't even having to pay.
And that was a concern that a lot of people in the Republic had. Not necessarily that was going on, but they were worried what the Republic might do to fix the problem, because they were so hesitant to bring new planets into the fold, because that meant that there was potentially going to be less wealth, for those core planets that have been there for a long time. So not only were the planets who were getting added to the Republic getting kind of a raw deal compared to the ones who had been there, but the process of getting recognized in the Republic itself was like long and arduous and made it difficult to even consider it worth the while to do so. It was getting to the point where it was going to be easier to just try and leave.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's the way that Palpatine and Dooku essentially took these issues, stirred the pot to get these people organized, then made them out to be a threat, and then rallied the Republic together in sort of a nationalistic way to then create a war and to then make an empire. I mean, he created his own enemy to then fight against, to then give the people a shared enemy so he could create this empire. I mean, it's honestly, when you sit back and look at everything that Palpatine did, it's really brilliant, and it's actually just really cool. Well, cool in like a storytelling sense, not not cool in like a don't do
try
that.
to do that.
Don't do that,
Don't do
kids.
this at home.
Don't do that.
I think it's also interesting. The Republic did have different parts of its politics. We mostly look at the Galactic Senate because that's the part that Palpatine took over fully and precipitated his rise to power as Emperor. But there was also the Jedi Order, which was a kind of separate from the Senate, but the Senate still controlled it a little bit.
Yeah.
You had the courts, which we don't see in any of the movies or the Clone Wars. We really don't know what the courts did, but they were still important because they've been mentioned a couple times.
Yeah.
And you also have the royalty and the high families.
Yeah.
Which, when you go into the book Bloodline, which is after, of course, it's very clear, though, that those royal families and those royal bloodlines held sway throughout the times of the Republic.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the Jedi thing is interesting. And I think the Jedi issue is a really fascinating point to bring up. Because the Jedi, when we're first told what they are, they're supposed to be the guardians of peace and justice throughout the galaxy. They talk about in episode 2 how Anakin and Obi-Wan are coming back from like a border dispute. Because that's kind of what the Jedi are there to do in theory, right? They're a group of people who are trained to be negotiators and peacekeepers, and the whole idea is that they could go to places that the Republic sort of couldn't, to defend people, to settle disagreements, to just defend those who could not defend themselves. But by the time you get to episode 1, and especially to episode 2, the Jedi are essentially in the pocket of the Republic and just do whatever the Republic is going to do. They're not going to go free slaves because Tatooine is not required to adhere to the laws of the Republic. Ideally, the Jedi should say slavery is wrong and should go out there and actually serve as a way to defend the helpless, the people who have been made slaves. But they won't.
Right.
Because it's not the Republic's concern. So therefore it becomes not the Jedi's concern.
Right. And the Republic creates a kind of a bubble for them to live in, which to a degree makes sense. Otherwise they would become the de facto leaders of the if they were allowed to just mete out justice as they chose, wherever they chose, then clearly the Republic would be under their control completely. The Senate would have no meaning, and they could expand the Republic as far as they wanted because they would just go fighting injustice wherever it lay.
Well, the Republic didn't have an army until episode 2.
Right.
The Republic had no organized military. You just had individual planets that had small militia forces. So the Republic really couldn't even... I don't know how the Republic was really enforcing its laws in the first place.
In a nutshell, they weren't.
Well, the Republic wasn't... I guess it was more like a real republic. That would be... it would basically like... people were expecting under the Federation. They were more like member states with shared trade laws, and that was about it. The Galactic Senate was basically there to keep trade laws in place, but they had figured out ways to make it not work anymore.
But if you're going to be a republic who then takes essentially more executive power, but then doesn't actually help the people in the republic that need it, and we're going to say, hey, we're going to kind of be a loosely defined group that just sort of sets some laws that are, for intergalactic trade, but then you're going to give a bunch of planets raw deals, and then you don't have any military force or peacekeeping force that's actually going to go out there and try to negotiate this stuff, or at least do it well, then of course you're going to have this separatist movement. You got to keep in mind that, that's what Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon were going to do. They were going to go and try and get this trade blockade settled peacefully, because that makes sense, because that's what they're there to do. And then that obviously just didn't happen because Darth Sidious didn't want a wrench thrown in his plans.
Right. And keeping in mind, we are living in, or what we've seen was, air quotes, waning years of the Republic. They were not at their height. They really had been completely mired down in politics because that's all they had. Trade negotiations don't need to happen every single day. Without politics, they didn't have a lot of use.
Yeah.
And I think they just created so much bureaucracy. Now, I would like to see what the courts were doing, what their jobs were, what they actually did, how they enforced their part of the universe. But they're not they're not discussed pretty much at all except for the fact that they exist, and we'll let the courts decide. That's about it.
Do we know how the Separatists felt about the role of the Jedi Order
They
in the
did
greater
not
galaxy?
like. They basically saw the Jedi, like, by the fact that they were experiencing issues and the Jedi were never dispatched to deal with them, it was seen as an ineffectiveness of the Jedi Order and of the Greater Republic.
And so,
One of the things about like the Separatist movement was that Count Dooku was their leader, and he was kind of this like celebrity. He was this man who was really famous for being a Jedi Master who left the Jedi, and he was really charismatic. So he goes to this group of people who are already experiencing issues, and he's like, this is the Republic's fault, and this is the Jedi's fault. They are hypocrites, and they are not enforcing these things, these values that they say they hold.
Yeah.
And this is, like, essentially just what he tells the Separatists, and they buy it because they're not seeing any evidence otherwise.
And I mean, in his defense, he's not even entirely wrong about it. The Jedi's view has been clouded by the dark side. Yes, ideally they do need to be able to answer to some form of authority. Obviously, you don't want the Jedi necessarily going around and doling out justice however they feel. So obviously, having a republic that they don't necessarily do the whim of, but at least are held accountable by, makes sense. And yet, the Jedi were really not overly helpful in ending this crisis in a peaceful way. I mean, you've got 10 years between Episode 1 and Episode 2 to try to uncover what's happening and try to resolve this peacefully before a war breaks out. And they failed to do that.
They also weren't really, in the eyes of, like, the Separatists, from what I understand it, weren't doing their job because their job was not really supposed to be to protect the Republic. It was to, like, protect peace in the entire galaxy. So when this war breaks out and they clearly take a side and take up arms and go and start fighting people, then, like, they're just not doing what Jedi are supposed to do.
And some planets viewed them strictly as kidnappers.
Mm-hmm.
They would come in
Yeah.
and take their children.
Yep.
Especially more force-sensitive species.
Yeah, as soon as the Jedi become generals in war,
Like,
they're kind of
already
not
hypocrites.
Jedi anymore.
Yeah.
It's why so many people point to what Luke does at the end of Last Jedi as like one of the penultimate like Jedi acts in the film, because it is. It's purely an act of defense. It's purely a tactic of, getting people away. It is not an aggressive move. It's a not tactful. It's a clever tactic that has nothing to do with being a big military general who storms the battlefield. As soon as you do that, that's why you had like Pong Krell, who fell to the dark side, and you've had Mace Windu, who is aggressive in his own nature.
Well, fell to the dark side / just agreed with the Separatists and was going to leave the Order.
Yeah.
Falling to the dark side is not exactly the same. With Dooku, it was.
Yeah.
But I hesitate to say Krell actually. Krell was a bad dude, but if Mace Windu, if we'd shown him having similar actions,
Yeah.
I think we would have felt the same way to him. Not really fell to the dark side. He was just someone who has like a very
I still think
angry
we
side.
see evidence that a lot of these Jedi do still clearly have values and things, but they're not necessarily upholding what the Jedi pledged to uphold anymore. They're not really Jedi. They're just light side users at this point.
Like, you have someone like Obi-Wan who believes in what the Republic and the Jedi Order are supposed to be, but almost fails to realize that it's no longer that. Like, they're becoming warped and
Qui-Gon.
Yeah.
Well, see,
Qui-Gon
Qui-Gon
tried
kind
to
of
leave
sees
several
it, though.
times.
Yeah, he is one of the
Qui-Gon
most
sees
Jedi
it.
Jedi. He's one of the most Jedi-y Jedi we ever see in these films. And I love that about Qui-Gon. And it would have been really interesting to see how Qui-Gon behaved if he had lived to see the Clone War.
What's the name of the spirits that teach Qui-Gon how to maintain his spirit on the light side? They taught Yoda.
The Clone Wars episode?
Yeah.
I don't know.
They're I want to say they're called the Force Priestesses.
Mm-hmm.
But they're essentially like the masks of emotion.
Yeah.
But the interesting part is that they picked Qui-Gon Mm-hmm. And I think that is one of the reasons. And in one of the recent comics, he was still struggling with should he stay with the Jedi Order or should he leave. Interesting enough, in the original canon, so pre-Disney, the reason Dooku left was because of the death of Qui-Gon Jinn. And then in the new canon, he left shortly before and then blamed himself for the death of Qui-Gon Jinn. Because if he had been there as his master, he would have saved him. Of course, it wouldn't have been his master anymore. Probably wouldn't have been around. But it's one of those butterfly effect questions.
Yeah. I would have been. It's interesting to see to think about how Qui-Gon would have reacted to everything that was happening, and it's kind of interesting that Qui-Gon's master is one of the ones who kicks off this whole war.
And I agree with Dooku. I think that Qui-Gon would have joined him if he was still alive, like he says on Geonosis and Attack of the Clones.
I think he would have.
Yeah, I don't think he would have joined them because of what they actually were. I think he would have sympathized with the Separatist cause, but would have recognized that that's not what the actual war was about.
Yeah, I think Qui-Gon's a little bit more perceptive.
I think he would have been more like Ahsoka and just kind of left altogether.
Yeah, well, exactly. But then again, his master being on the other side, maybe go with his master.
Yeah. We'll see. Then again, I'm just like, maybe he would have stayed with the Jedi Order so that somebody with a level head was there.
That's true.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of a tangent.
A little bit.
But I mean, if he had lived, then nothing probably would have turned out the same because he would have been Anakin's mentor. And I think Anakin could probably have talked to him about more things than he felt he could with Obi-Wan. They would have had a very different dynamic than Anakin had with Obi-Wan.
And Qui-Gon was known for going against the Council. Obi-Wan was not.
Yeah, so if you have Anakin who's starting to he's really struggling with these feelings of intimacy and love that he's sharing with Padme, if you have someone like Qui-Gon who's already known for being, kind of a maverick, kind of against the grain, you're absolutely right. I think he could have potentially felt more comfortable coming to Qui-Gon, who was almost like a father figure to him in Episode 1. Absolutely. Yes. But
it would be nice in the new movies to see a Qui-Gon moment.
Yeah.
At this point. I mean, we haven't seen the full Qui-Gon Force Ghost. We just heard a little voice sound clip. Did we even get a voice sound clip of him?
In what?
In Episode 3? Or no, he was just told that Qui-Gon had talked to you.
Yeah, he was just
there was nothing. We haven't gotten anything.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, come on. We've already got the Yoda Force Ghost. We got everyone. We need Qui-Gon.
He showed up as he showed up in the I cannot pronounce his name. The Genndy Tartakovsky Clone Wars. He shows up as a Force Ghost in that, or in a flashback or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important to talk about the Jedi's role in the war, though, because the Jedi are kind of a key. They're kind of a key political point in the conflict. I mean, without the Jedi, the Separatists probably would have won. Yeah.
Because that's a big factor, was taking out all these Jedi. Without the Jedi, General Grievous wouldn't have gone down, so...
That's true. General Grievous was...
and he'd already killed many Jedi.
Yeah, a monstrous fighter. Someone who could clearly kill Jedi. So you can imagine, yeah, exactly, that war without the Jedi. And of course, when Palpatine gives his speech... he almost shifts the blame of the war kind of partially to the Jedi, calling them out for assassinating him and kind of saying look, we've kind of gotten the main bulk of this war done, but the Jedi are still a problem.
I would love to hear the whole text to that speech.
Yeah.
Because it was a start to finish, and, if you look at the facts, it was. They showed up at a Trade Federation thing, they picked a side, the side of Naboo. They blew up the Federation ship.
Yeah.
They destroyed it. And then they went and secretly had an army made, which they did.
Yep.
Then, of course, the Trade Federation, to protect themselves, are still going to continue to create droid armies.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, boom! Jedi show up, destroy their factory, which we don't even know if it was illegal to have at the time. Probably wasn't.
No.
Suddenly.
And
It wasn't.
yeah.
It was a completely.
And then
unrelated thing.
the Jedi go and they occupy every planet.
No, the entirety of Geonosis is the start of the war, and it was completely nobody voted on it. The Jedi just showed up and occupied Geonosis and drove out these Separatists and started the war, basically.
And every planet since, who was the first person, like really the first people on the ground? Mm-hmm. It was always the Jedi showing up, offering help. Toydaria or Waterworld.
Oh, Moncal.
Yeah,
Is it
Moncala.
Moncala.
The Jedi were always
I
there.
get them and the people confused.
Yeah.
'Cause it's
Yeah.
the same name.
The Jedi always would show up, say, we're here to help. And then when they left, guess what they left? They left a garrison of their clone troopers.
Yeah. I mean, you look at when Obi-Wan shows up on Utapau, and, he's like, there's no war here unless you've brought it with you. And I mean, clearly, Grievous was already there with the Separatists, so obviously there was a degree of lying there. But I mean, clearly that's kind of the attitude that people were having about the Jedi and about this whole war in the first place.
I mean, if Grievous was there, though, there wasn't war. It was just they were hanging out for a while.
True.
It was just that was a base for them to be there, and they weren't fighting anyone. They didn't bring conflict.
Yeah, they were just... You're right. And the Separatists always have that going for them. The Jedi, in a certain light, were completely the driving force behind it. And if you watch the Clone Wars, in all the meetings where Palpatine is discussing things, he's typically the one saying, well, do we really need to do that? I don't think this is a good idea.
Yeah.
And we're going to do a Clone Wars rewatch here soon. I think that would be something interesting to really look at Palpatine as the good guy the whole time.
Yeah.
And, I mean, obviously, in the background, he's manipulating everything.
Yeah.
But in the foreground, you can clearly see every vote, everything that's going on is kind of anti-Jedi. The Jedi are always wanting something Palpatine doesn't want. Mm-hmm. But then in the end, it always works out for him. And I bet you when he has that final speech, it's going to be like, the Jedi wanted us to do this. We said no. And then the Jedi created a situation where we said yes.
Yeah.
The Jedi wanted this other... They wanted an army, and we said no. But they made one anyway. They just more...
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's what happened. The Military Creation Act never even really got around to getting past. The Jedi just started the war and then suddenly had a clone army.
Yep. Because Sifo Dyas commissioned one in secret 10 years ago. And, it's interesting because you look at Phantom Menace and you see, it's really interesting to look at Palpatine during the Clone Wars and during Episode 2 to compare him to Phantom Menace. Like, in Phantom Menace, Palpatine is just this random senator from Naboo. And he's just getting the ball rolling. He's just like, I need this treaty signed. Like, I've got this one thing. This one single conflict needs to play out exactly the way I want it to. So that way I can gain just enough power to keep the ball rolling. And then you go from that to you can just watch the snowball as he gains more and more power. And as he, starts for this one trade dispute that gone awry into a full-blown war. Where he's
the Galactic Empire.
Yeah, into the Galactic Empire, where he's able to stoke the very real concerns about corruption and overreach of the Republic and the Jedi, and he's able to stoke that and manipulate that and basically turn the Republic in against itself and turn it into an empire.
What is it that Luke says on Octo about the dark side? It shows you something you will need. It
showed what to Rey, that it showed her something she wanted and you couldn't resist it, something like that.
Something similar, but sometimes when they're talking about the dark side, they're talking about how it shows you what you need to see. Anyway, lost that train of thought.
Okay,
but it felt good when I was saying it.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, Palpatine just masterful job taking over the universe and turning it. Like I said, if
He does a real good job taking over
the
the
universe, fantastic job.
Well
I'd
done.
hire him for it.
There's also an interesting kind of relationship between how the Empire comes into power as a sort of very anti-alien group, and how they enslave a lot of aliens, because most of the Separatist movement was comprised of non-humans. The majority of systems and everything in the Separatists were non-human, which was a big problem within the Republic. Like, the Republic was actively putting out propaganda that had more aliens featured on it, because they didn't want to seem like they were the human group, but they completely were. Whereas the Separatists, every time the Republic put out like anti-Trade Federation stuff or anti-Banking Clan stuff, trying to convince the people to turn against these groups in power, these particular groups would look at it and just be like, this is blatantly like racist propaganda. Like, this is just anti-Nemoidian stuff that they are putting out that like talks about actual stereotypes of Nemoidian people and stuff. And the Republic just put this out because they thought it was okay, because they were all humans and they didn't really care about these alien issues, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that.
And then we see that evolve into the Empire takes power and then feels justified in like punishing these separatist worlds, which turns into a very anti-alien sympathy going on throughout Imperial times. A lot of people don't trust a lot of kinds of aliens, which in part is because of their participation in the separatist movement.
And most of the separatist ones,
Or at least they can attribute it to that. Instead of calling it just straight out racism, they can say it's because they allied with the separatists.
Yeah.
we really don't see a lot of the separatist ones after the original war. The alien species we do run in tend to be the ones that stayed with the Galactic Republic and that were eventually either enslaved or something similar. I'm thinking about Mon Cala specifically. And Mon Cala is a really interesting example because that's one that Anakin worked very hard to maintain, to save.
The Quarrens,
and then he's the one who eventually enslaved it to the Empire. And that's a consistent theme, is either Anakin saved them from the Separatists and then came back as Darth Vader and enslaved them, or Anakin lost them to the Separatists and it didn't matter because they were just going to wipe them out anyway. I think it's funny that he all these relationships and people that he met and knew and went to their planets and knew them as Anakin Skywalker. He comes back as Darth Vader and now is their worst nightmare.
Yeah, he still ends up messing everything up.
Yeah.
For all these people.
It's complicated. What else can you say about Star Wars politics other than that they are complicated? I think of the three conflicts, obviously there's a lot of stuff about the Empire and the Rebellion, but it's a pretty standard. The Empire is the governing body. They have a heavy-handed, way of ruling, and the Rebellion is a group of rebels. The First Order and the New Republic, you're essentially dealing with a republic that's already kind of getting some of the same issues of the Old Republic, and what is essentially a very well-funded terrorist organization.
Well, we will discuss that.
Yes. And then you look at the prequel conflict, and I would argue that the Separatist versus Republic conflict is the most politically complex of the three major ones that we've seen. And part of that is because of how much time the Clone Wars dedicated to talking about the politics here. I mean, you've got that episode with Padme's ex, with Rush Clovis, where it's made very clear that, these are not just straight up bad guys. There are people who don't realize that there is a puppet master here, and they just very strongly believe that, the Republic is failing them and that the Separatists, do have good intentions. So, I mean, there's so much devoted to the conflict between the Separatists and the Republic. I think it's the most politically complex and potentially the most politically interesting of the three major conflicts we've had.
Yeah, I mean, I really obviously like the First Order New Republic conflict, and I can go on about that for a really long time. But I mean, I think that's probably true in the sense that because the prequel trilogy was kind of about this group of people who are the protagonists winning this war and portraying the Separatists as the bad guys, only to have the good guys essentially become the Galactic Empire, who are the ultimate bad guys. So you already have this, like, we have seen this group of people who we're told is all, like, bad. They're all evil. But then we kind of find out in the same vein, though you kind of already know because you've seen the originals, but the Republic turns into the Empire, which is clearly evil. So, like, which side actually was right? It's much harder to tell because none of the issues are completely black and white. Whereas, like, obviously with the Empire and the First Order, you can go on, and I probably will when we get to those videos about how justified, like, certain actions are and how there are people who very much believe in these causes, but that the overarching thing is still corrupt. But with this one, it's significantly more complicated because even the bad guys that we're told are the bad guys end up not being, kind of. So
I think one thing I just want to point out from a pure filmmaking standpoint, I think the prequels cause this amazing level of, like, dissonance that's really interesting, right? Because you're not watching these in chronological order. Everyone was exposed to them in release order. So you've got the yeah, well, most of us did. You've got the white stormtrooper armor and the triangular Star Destroyers, which ever since 1977 have in the Star Wars universe been this symbol of, like, a, you know, strong-fisted fascist empire.
And
And
that's
then-
become the
Yeah.
short-term, not the short-term, the shorthand in cinema as well.
Yeah.
Angular, white armor, or single-colored armor.
Right. So you have in the Empire and in the original trilogy, you so heavily associate the iconography of the Empire, with the bad guys, with the heavy-handed rulers. So then when you get to the prequels, and it's this, like, weird dissonance, like, you don't even know how to feel about it. You see these clones who are presented as heroic, and you see these proto Star Destroyers, and you're wanting to root for them because the movie is framing them as the good guys.
And the
but
first
in
Imperial March.
Yeah, but in the back of your head, you're like, there's, like, this unease where you're just like, no, like, they're the good guys, but, like, they look like the bad guys, and it creates this really interesting emotional reaction to seeing them. And I think that's part of the reason why they started giving the clones more color and stuff, because you look at Republic Star Destroyers, you know, they have, like, the red on them, they are slightly more rounded, they're not quite as angular, and you look at the clones, they have, you know, varying color pieces on their armor to denote, you know, what type of trooper they are. So, like, they still use the iconography of the Empire, so you still in the back of your head always know that these guys are going to turn out to be the bad guys, but then they sort of, you know, it's smoothed down, so it you still can kind of root for them at the same time, because in that moment they are the good guys, essentially.
Like the Senate Guard eventually becoming the Imperial Royal Guard.
Yeah.
That was one I was extremely interested in. My favorite thing in all of Star Wars when I watched Episode 1 was still the Return of the Jedi with the Imperial Royal Guard. And when I saw the Senate Guards, I flipped out. I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Because you know what they're going to become. Mm-hmm. And the first time you see them, and then when you get to the end and they're in Naboo and they're with Palpatine, you're like, that's the beginning right there. That's how it starts. You're right. It flows so
Yeah,
well.
they just take it, and then they change something about it to make it more palatable for the story they're telling, and you can slowly see it morph into what it will become. And, you know, it's easy to kind of think, well, like, of course that's what happened, because we know that the Republic became the Empire, but it's just very interesting to see, and it creates this weird, to me at least, it's a very odd emotional reaction to watching the actions being presented as heroic, when in the back of your mind you know how this story ends. Carly, any finishing thoughts?
Yes, I'd like to touch on, just speaking of the clones and everything, that's another thing that really gets brought up in the conflict between the Separatists and the Republic, is that the Separatists are looking at this as the Republic has just pulled an army of slaves, essentially. These are living human beings who were created, and all they do is go out and die for the Republic.
Yeah,
they have no lives, they have nothing, and the Separatists are like, look, we're using droids.
Yeah.
Like, at the end of the day, like, and most people had fairly anti-droid sentiments at the time. A lot of people didn't trust them. So it's not like they were viewing them as this other group that was also sentient. Because regardless,
serve your kind.
yeah,
Here.
regardless of whether or not people agreed with that, like, most people just didn't. Most people didn't see droids as something that also deserved to have autonomy. So the Separatists are using this army of robots, basically. They're not using living beings that were born to go to war.
Yeah.
These were created. And if they die, then it's, to most of them anyway, it doesn't feel like a loss of life. Whereas the Republic is using living, breathing people who go out and bleed and die for no purpose other than they won't let the Separatists go.
Yeah, and they even touch on that when you have, gosh dang it, I cannot remember his name, but you have the one clone trooper who leaves and starts a family, and
Yeah.
the clones are, their initial reaction to that is like, how dare you? Like, we are warriors, that's what we do. And he's like, we had no choice.
Yeah.
We were bred to do that. What if I don't want that? And yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the ethics of making an army of living sentient people and just being like, okay, yeah, I've created you. Your purpose is to go die in war. Like,
Because
Good
Oh, it is
Lord.
extremely
we can talk
evil.
about like
Yeah.
how the First
Thank you,
Order
Jedi.
like grows children up and teaches them this stuff, but like the First Order is not operating on this level. They do not create human life to take it away. Like, it's a very different issue than anything the Empire or the First Order even does. Like, the Republic is, they just make these people who would not otherwise have existed just to have them die.
yeah, whereas what
They
the First
even give
Order
them a
was-
lesser quality of life by making them like age faster and stuff. Like, it's kind of horrendous when you look at the ethics of the science
Yeah.
behind all this.
The first episode of Clone Wars covers it nicely with Yoda sitting there with some of the clones, and they're
Yeah.
basically saying, we don't matter, we've got numbers. The clones themselves hadn't really recognized their self-worth at that point.
Yeah.
And Yoda's like, no, you all have purpose and you all have differences, and in the Force I see you all as different things. And yet Yoda was still fine using them as a...
Yep.
As a
No, there's
as an army. There's a disconnect.
There's an inherent hypocrisy there.
Yes,
Um,
there's a reason I don't
and-
like the Jedi.
That speaks to the larger hypocrisy of the because Plo Koon does the same thing.
Or, we're expendable, sir. Not to me.
But aren't they?
They are. They're completely expendable before you, Plo.
And the whole thing was that clones,
Crow was the only one who was honest about it.
and a lot of it had to do with that clones were more adept fighters. Like, you put a room of clones versus a room of droids, and if it's standard clones versus standard battle droids, the clones are going to come out on top pretty much every time. Of course, that changes when you have, like, droid Dakars and super battle droids, and it comes to the point where it's like, when you've got an army of super battle droids and droid Dakars, does it really matter that the clones are, like, thinking better as a real person? Like, what is, like, that's still a giant, like, you know, super battle droid, like...
And like part of the Republic's reasoning in using them is that they didn't have time to create a real army, but if you hadn't been like gridlocked in indecision for so long,
Yeah.
maybe that could have been done.
Yeah, like, obviously it was too
So-
late to start drafting a ton of people, because even if you drafted right now, the Clone War lasted 3 years. Like, you can't train people.
And I mean, it also goes to the Republic's like inability to act in that the entirety of the Republic was okay with using clones because none of them wanted to leave home and go join a war.
Clones that
It's so
most
much
of them-
easier to send these other people off that we don't recognize as people.
It's one of the things that maybe I missed a piece of lore that really digs into this. Maybe I missed a novel that's out that really digs into this. But, like, clones that, like, no one knew even existed. Like, if what would have happened if Sifo-Dyas had not put in the order for that clone army to be made? What would have happened if he had not called up Armies Are Us on Camino and been like, yeah, I need an order of one army, thank you. Like, if that had not happened, and then suddenly this whole conflict comes to a brouhaha, like, the Republic is just... it comes to a hoopla. It comes to a brouhaha. Like, suddenly, the Republic would just be defenseless, because what does it have? But, like, no. They're just like, oh, man, hey, I found this clone army. I guess one of us Jedi ordered it a while ago. I don't know, you want to use it? And Yoda's just like, yeah, sure, why not?
Yep.
Like, is that not a red flag to, like, anybody? And they're like, oh, we need to vote on the creation of a military. It's already been created. It exists. It's right there. Mm-hmm. And no one questions it. Like, no one's just like, oh, this is clearly some ploy to get us involved in a war. Like,
I think it's all in the first 20 minutes of Palpatine's speech.
like, someone should have just been like, why is there an army already prepared for us conveniently as we are on the brink of war? God, the Republic deserved to fall. This stupid.
And of course, Sifo-Dyas probably didn't put in the order. I think it was Tyrannus.
Yeah.
Just taking his place because I don't know. Did they get specific about that? There was like 3 episodes in the Clone Wars where they tried to find Sifo-Dyas.
Sifo-Dyas, as far as we know in canon, did commission it.
Yeah.
Because I looked it up as we were talking about this. Because I don't know. We don't know entirely
we are
the whole story.
This up.
You know, and it's interesting because, you know, Sifo-Dyas, let's see here.
Jedi mission led by Poe Tyrannus is master mysterious, Darth Sidious was furious.
I mean, no. He commissioned it. We just don't really know why. He was just creating an army for the Republic.
Like, I don't want to make myself look like I'm just, like, totally missing some part of Star Wars canon that everyone knows about.
Reasonably sure we don't.
It's this area right here. They accepted Tyrannus' offer and shot down Sifo-Dyas.
Why was it? I just don't. I don't know.
I don't think we know.
I think the idea.
Most likely it was some sort of message from Sidious or something like that.
Yeah.
Orchestrating the whole Clone War, but yeah, I don't believe it has ever been touched on.
But we know that Palpatine was still behind it because they had the chips in them for Order 66.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we know that he at least found out about it and interceded. But yeah.
Another thing that will probably be covered.
Yeah.
Someday.
It's I mean we're kind of being we're not really covering a lot before episode 1 until I imagine we get this the saga finished out, but
yeah.
Once the saga's
finished, much before episode 1,
there's going to just be a flood of new material.
Did you ever play Star Wars Bounty Hunter?
No.
Okay, so it takes place before episode 1, and like the line in episode 2 where Obi-Wan's like, oh, hey, Jango, like, you were approached by, like, Sifo-Dyas, right? And Jango's like, I've never heard of him. I was approached by a man named Tyrannus on one of the moons of Ogden. Right. Like, that's what that entire game is about. Like, that's what that entire game leads up to that conversation where, like, Darth Tyrannus puts out a bounty on this chick named Kamari Vosa, who's, like, proto-Asajj Ventress, and it's just, like, whoever kills her will get, like, a big reward. And so, like, you fight a bunch of other bounty hunters, and you kill her on one of the moons of Bogdan, then Dooku shows up, and it's just like, cool. Your reward is that you get to be the basis for a whole giant army.
Actually, that conversation's been recanonized. Star Wars comic Knights of the Old... No. What's it called? I think it's called just the Old Republic, and it's an entire Jango takes Boba out for a mission, and he has some flashbacks to Tyrannus.
Oh, okay.
Talking to him on the planet.
I bet Kamari Vosa isn't canon anymore.
I don't think she is.
Yeah. Well, this has been an interesting episode. the Clone Wars are kind of interesting, and the lead up to the Clone Wars are interested in how complex the political system got, and really how complex Palpatine's plan was, how interwoven throughout all these little elements and all these little individual conflicts it was. And Carly, do you have any finishing thoughts?
I don't think so.
Cool. Rob, anything to finish us out? Anything you want to say?
I think there's one great line from the Clone Wars, because you were talking about the clones being flesh and blood. I think we have to remember the droids had emotions too. Yoda goes in and he's attacking a tank, and he cuts out the bottom of it, and you just see his green lightsaber, the hue from his green lightsaber coming from the top, and there's a droid that just screams, "Oh no, I just got promoted!" And I feel for that droid.
I feel for all the battle droids. I
Yeah.
love them.
Yeah.
I adore them.
I think there's something to be said about like the inherent portrayal of Jedi as like super hardcore warrior badasses who are just taking down these tanks, and the droids as kind of helpless things that are just getting massacred.
Not another Jedi.
Right, because I mean the Jedi, when we were introduced to them, Yoda was saying, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter, and like wars not make one great, and stuff like that. And then I've seen someone cut that speech with footage of fighting from the prequels to be like, look, George Lucas doesn't know what he's talking about. His own movies go against what he preached. And I'm like,
They don't.
that was the point. Like, the whole point was that the Jedi in the prequels were not really, truly
Or in the originals.
Jedi.
I will never not dislike Yoda and Obi-Wan for being complete hypocrites for everything they say.
Oh, for just lying to
Like,
Luke.
they're just two characters that I'm that person who just doesn't really like them because they lie constantly to Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And to really the galaxy,
Well, from
to
a
themselves.
certain point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. Like, no.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's bad.
I mean, I don't think there's any Star Wars parody thing that deals with Obi-Wan from A New Hope and doesn't have him lie to people constantly.
Yeah. It
No, you
bothers
don't.
me.
You didn't see that.
Yeah.
They
Didn't
portray
happen.
themselves as these, like, really great pinnacles of justice and goodness in the galaxy and go around telling other people what to do, but they're complete hypocrites.
Yeah. I mean, it's another discussion for another day. But yeah. And I think
Spiraled down into another I Hate Jedi podcast again.
Well, theoretically, it's not that you hate Jedi, it's that you hate these people who are calling themselves Jedi.
That's true.
that's
Because
fair.
the, like, actual tenets and stuff make Qui-Gon seem like the most real Jedi of all of them. And I quite like Qui-Gon. I think that he's pretty upfront with most things
Yeah.
he thinks, so...
Qui-Gon has some in that Jedi code book that's not really canon anymore because it's got like people who don't exist who have written notes in it. But like Qui-Gon has really cool notes in it, and we're gonna get the Claudia
Qui-Gon,
Gray
yeah.
book, and I'm real excited
I'm
to learn
looking
more about
forward to that.
Qui-Gon.
What are we got another month before the Claudia Gray one comes out?
I don't know
Is it
the
March
release
or
date.
April?
That's-
I want to say March 20 something.
I feel like we have digressed.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
that was your fault. You were asking for final thoughts.
It's okay. We're gonna make it to an hour, and we haven't quite made it to an hour yet. So,
We're renaming the channel Star Wars Digression.
April.
April. Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
Star Wars, but we digress.
But I would like just like there's a topic, but by the end of the video you're flipping on something else. It's like I don't know.
We just so we start with one topic and then we pull another topic out of a hat.
There's a little-
and we have to make it to that new topic.
The museum curator in Animal Crossing, that's his catchphrase, is, but I digress.
But
We'll just get his picture on
I
everything.
have not played like any Animal Crossing at all, and I feel like that's like a big gap in my gamer knowledge. But yeah, no. So this has been fun. Stop laughing at me, Rob. All right, well, I think I'm gonna go ahead and end it there. But this has been a fun discussion. We kind of digressed a little bit all over the place. Tell us what you think about the Clone Wars. If you have what
If you know what went down with Sifo Dyas,
Yeah, please let us know.
Please let us know, because we cannot seem to figure it out.
Yeah, we that's clearly a blind spot for us. So if you know more about what was going on with why Sifo Dyas actually placed that order,
Canon only.
canon only, get out of here with that Legends crap. I'm sorry. But yeah, no, just canon stuff. If you know what's going on with Sifo Dyas, please inform us, because we don't know everything. We're only human. I'm Matt.
I am Carly.
And I, Rob, have been
That was supposed to be
Yoda. But it
Okay.
didn't work. It didn't work. I've been Rob.
I hate you.
No. Feelings similar. I don't like myself either.
Oh no! That's not what I meant.